The village of St. Mildred's, like many nestled across the rolling English countryside, wore its traditions like a second skin. Nothing ever really changed there. Seasons came and went, gardens bloomed and withered, children grew up and inherited the manners or scandals of their parents. And yet it was precisely this quiet rhythm that made any disruption feel seismic. That Saturday in early June had begun with birdsong and a high, clear sky, just the sort of day the Garden Club hoped for when they scheduled their annual summer tea. The club had secured the vicarage lawn for the occasion and a dozen small, round tables, each draped in hand-embroidered linens, dotted the lawn like spinning plates in a conjurer's act. Glass jugs of elderflower cordial and towers of finger sandwiches made a brave stand against the mid-afternoon sun. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the shade of a pear tree, her seat chosen not by accident but with the same quiet calculation that marked much of her life. She could see most of the gathering from her vantage point without, crucially, being at the center of it. She wore a light dove-gray dress with a pale blue scarf tucked neatly at her throat. Her hat, trimmed with just one cornflower, sat at a slight but deliberate angle. She stirred her tea slowly, her eyes watching rather than wandering. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that where people gathered, truths inevitably slipped out, usually not through what was said, but through what was hurried over, misremembered, or not said at all. "Have you tried the lemon drizzle, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Lavinia Marsh, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Cooked by young Sarah Lockwood. Her mother claims she made it herself, but we all know who really held the whisk." Miss Marple smiled. "It's quite good. A touch of too much zest, perhaps. But effort always deserves praise." "Oh, how generous you are," said Mrs. Marsh, who was decidedly not. Just then Mrs. Holloway appeared, adjusting her large feathered hat and fanning herself with a makeshift pamphlet. "Isabel Jedge hasn't arrived," she announced, placing a slight emphasis on the name as though this absence were both scandalous and extraordinary. Miss Marple looked up. "Are you sure?" she asked mildly. "Quite," sniffed Mrs. Holloway. "She was meant to deliver my niece's wedding gown this morning. No answer when I called. And it's not like her to miss a tea of all things. She's practically part of the Garden Club furniture." There was a stir around the lawn as several ladies craned their necks to assess the truth of this. Isabel Jedge was, by all accounts, a fixture of village life. A seamstress of extraordinary precision, she had worked on christening gowns and funeral shrouds and everything in between. What she lacked in conversation, she made up for in competence. She lived alone in Jedge Cottage on the southern edge of the village, kept a spotless garden of medicinal herbs and heritage roses, and was known to boil nettle tea each Tuesday, "for the joints," she once explained tersely. "She's never late," agreed Mrs. Weatherby, a round, cheery widow who kept bees and opinions in equal measure. "Not even during the snowstorm of '52, remember? She walked 2 miles in galoshes to deliver a hemmed skirt to Miss Dobbins, slipped on black ice and still made it to evensong." "Her blinds were drawn this morning," said Percy Bostock, the postmaster, leaning in from the next table. "I pass her cottage twice a day. 8 o'clock blinds drawn. Midday still drawn. Odd," murmured Miss Marple. The chatter grew as speculation took root. Was she unwell? Had she fallen? "Left suddenly?" "She was finishing alterations." "On 3 garments this week," said Mrs. Partridge. A sour-faced woman known for recording misfortunes with the tenacity of a stenographer. She wouldn't just abandon that work. Miss Marple's eyes took in the scene. The ladies' dresses fluttered lightly in the breeze, their sun hats tilted against the light. Beneath the genteel smiles and teacups, something darker was growing. Concern, yes, but also fascination. The kind villagers feel when something unusual pierces the veil of routine. "I believe I might stroll down to her cottage," Miss Marple said gently, as though offering to fetch more scones. "Just to check in. I'm sure it's nothing at." "Oh, do let us know," said Mrs. Weatherby, her voice dropping. "You've got the nose for these things." Miss Marple demurred with a smile, but her eyes, cool and precise, had already begun drawing connections. Jedge Cottage stood just beyond the hedgerows bordering the south end of the village, near a disused footpath that once led to the old mill. The path there was shaded by sycamores, and the chirping of wrens was the only sound to accompany Miss Marple's walk. The cottage itself was modest, whitewashed walls, a thatched roof, a gate that squeaked reliably. Its neatness was almost unnerving. The roses were in full bloom, the shutters painted a calm shade of lavender, and the herb beds were trimmed into small geometric patches. Everything here bespoke order, habit, and quietness. Miss Marple unlatched the gate. It swung open. The front path was cobbled, but her sharp eyes noted a pair of dried leaves stuck oddly to one of the stones, as though pressed down by force. She knocked once at the blue-painted front door. Nothing. She knocked again, louder this time. Still no response. Walking slowly around the side of the house, she paused at the side garden, which was half-sheltered by ivy-covered trellis, a basket. A freshly clipped lavender lay overturned near the bench. Unusual, Miss Jedge was known for her tidiness, tools put away, work completed, spaces swept. More curious still, a wooden spool of thread had rolled into the flower bed. Miss Marple stooped to pick it up, ivory silk, the same thread used on wedding gowns. She looked toward the back window. Curtains were drawn. No sound. She hesitated for only a moment before gently testing the back door. It creaked open. Inside, the air was still almost reverent. A slight smell of rose oil and starch hung in. The kitchen was spotless. A clean teacup upside down on a drying rack, a dish towel folded neatly. The parlor was equally precise. The curtains were half closed, allowing narrow blades of sunlight to cut across the furnishings. The sewing machine sat on a table near the window, needles still threaded. The dummy stood upright, displaying a gown of elegant satin with lace-fringed sleeves. Miss Marple stepped carefully, avoiding scuffing the floor. A silver pair of scissors lay on a cloth next to the gown. A pincushion shaped like a tomato sat on a shelf, pristine and untouched. But then her gaze fell on the armchair beside the sewing table. There, a small round sewing tin lay open. Inside were needles, threads, buttons, and one empty indent. The thimble was missing. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. Isabel Jedge never worked without her thimble. She once described it as an extension of the hand. In a rare flash of metaphor, she bent slightly and noticed the edge of something metallic beneath the cushion. She reached down, extracting a bent sewing needle. Its tip was snapped and the middle curved unnaturally, as if it had been caught between two heavy surfaces. Miss Marple stood slowly. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no chaos, and no Isabel Jedge. She glanced around one last time and returned to the dress. A pale pink chalk mark had been traced at the waist half, rubbed away, as though someone had brushed against it hastily. She adjusted the spool in her hand. A seamstress may misplace a pin. But a missing thimble, a bent needle, an upturned lavender basket, it all spoke not of disorder but of interruption. Yes, Miss Marple murmured aloud, her voice soft but sure. Something has gone terribly wrong. Chapter 2. The village reacts. Word count. Approximately 1,175 by the following morning. News of Isabel Jedge's unexplained absence had spread through St. Mildred's like butter on warm toast. It began, as these things often did, at the bakery. Mrs. Holloway, claiming noble concern but clearly glowing with the thrill of breaking a story, announced in a slightly hushed voice that she had heard from a very reliable source that Miss Jedge was nowhere to be found. I mean completely gone. Her bed was made, curtains drawn, back door open, no note. Not even a kettle left whistling. She doesn't drive, does she? Asked Mr. Watts, the butcher, slicing through a haunch of beef with a deliberation that suggested he was picturing something far more satisfying. No, answered Mrs. Holloway, practically bouncing on her heels. And certainly not in the middle of the night, which is when I suspect she disappeared. A woman doesn't simply vanish at noon, not in this village. By mid-morning, the post office queue was buzzing with theories. Percy Bostock, the postmaster, whose walking route gave him a daily visual on the comings and goings of half the village, gave a stern nod and added weight to the rumor mill. "I passed her house at 10 to 8, he said, pushing up his glasses. "Blinds still drawn, and again at 11:35. "Still drawn? Back garden unnaturally quiet? No laundry on the line either? Mark my words, something's off." From the vicarage to the general store, speculation poured forth in various shades of alarm. Some suspected sudden illness. Others leaned toward misadventure, perhaps. She had tripped and hit her head while out gathering lavender and was now lying somewhere in the woods. A few whispered darker possibilities, their voices dropping as they leaned closer, a prowler, a burglar, someone from her past. As is the way in small villages, personal grievances and suspicions began to lace the gossip. "Well, you remember, that time she refused to alter Clara Winthrop's dress because she said the hem was unflatteringly ambitious," said Mrs. Weatherby in the post office. "That sort of comment builds enemies." "She didn't like men, that much was plain," added old Mr. Calthorpe, narrowing his eyes as if suspicious of any woman who kept a neat lawn and a closed mouth. "Never married. Too secretive by half." Even among the more sensible residents, the mood had shifted palpably. St. Mildred's had weathered many things: floods, feuds, and once an unfortunately boisterous amateur production of Macbeth, but not this. Not a person simply vanishing? By the time Miss Marple returned from Jedge Cottage, having spent the morning speaking quietly with the local constable and mentally cataloguing every oddity within the seamstress's home, the village was a bubbling cauldron of chatter. Miss Marple stopped first at the vicarage, where she found Reverend Hargreaves polishing brass candlesticks in the nave. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, looking up with a hopeful smile. "You've heard the rumblings, I take it?" "I have indeed," she replied, removing her gloves. "And I'm afraid there is cause for concern. Miss Jedge appears not to have left her home of her own volition." The vicar's face fell, the cloth in his hand slowing. "Dear me, do you suspect foul play?" Miss Marple paused. "Let's just say that it feels deliberate." There were signs of interrupted routine. A half-finished gown, a missing thimble, rather an important detail for someone so meticulous. It would be unlike her to leave her tools behind, let alone an open door. The vicar sat down slowly. "This village has known its share of discontent, but nothing like this." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "People keep more secrets than they think, particularly in places like ours where privacy wears the mask of politeness." She rose. "I think it might be useful to have a word with Sarah Lockwood. She visited Miss Jedge recently for a fitting and may have noticed something we haven't." Sarah Lockwood lived in a small cottage behind her parents' home, an arrangement made to seem independent but watched closely by Mrs. Lockwood's sharp eyes. She opened the door with a nervous smile when Miss Marple arrived. "I was hoping you'd come," Sarah said at once. "Everyone's talking, but no one's doing anything useful." Miss Marple stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of jasmine and new paint. Sarah's hands fidgeted with the edge of a cushion. "You visited Miss Jedge 2 days ago, did you not?" "Yes, for the wedding gown. She was in fine spirits. Told me to stand up straight or she'd sew my corset shut," Sarah said with a shaky laugh. "She seemed normal, focused. Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone stopping by? Any signs of distress?" Sarah thought for a long moment. "No, but there was something odd now that I think of it. Just as I was leaving, someone knocked at her door. She looked startled, like she hadn't expected company." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did you see who it was?" "No, I was already stepping off the stoop, and I heard her say, 'I thought I told you not to come here.' Very sharp, very un-Jedge. Then the door closed quickly. I thought maybe it was someone collecting payment early or something like that." "Did the voice at the door sound male or female?" "Male, I think, low, calm, didn't say much, just one word, 'please.' Then I heard the door close." Miss Marple nodded. "You've been very helpful, my dear." "Thank you." Sarah bit her lip. "Do you think something's happened to her? Something bad?" "I think," said Miss Marple, gently patting her hand, "that we are unraveling the first threads of a very old pattern." Later that day, as clouds rolled in from the east and cast the village in a strange, pewter-colored light, Miss Marple sat by her window with a notebook open before her. On the left side she had written names: Isabel Jedge, Sarah Lockwood, Mrs. Holloway, Percy Bostock, Rev. Hargreaves. On the right side were details, threads, bent needles, a missing thimble, a lavender basket overturned. Each fact was a petal of the flower, but the stem remained unseen. There was something about the scene in Jedge Cottage that lingered uncomfortably in her mind, not because of what was present, but because of what was missing: the absence of struggle, the calmness, the silence. People rarely disappeared without leaving traces, if not physical, then emotional. Miss Marple looked out at the rose bushes just beginning to bloom in her garden. She recalled Isabel's skill, her strict privacy, her withdrawn kindness. People like that built walls around themselves, not out of fear but out of necessity. And sometimes those walls weren't tall enough to keep the past out. She closed the notebook softly. Tomorrow she would begin asking the questions no one else dared to ask, not about where Isabel had gone, but about why someone might want her gone. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. Word count: approximately 1,170 by Monday morning. The local constabulary had been officially notified. It was Constable Rohu who appeared on Jedge Cottage's garden path, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 20s with kind eyes and a cautious manner. He didn't often handle disappearances, mostly rowdy sheepdogs and the occasional pilfered vegetable from the allotment, but he took the matter seriously. Miss Jedge, after all, was not the sort to disappear without cause. He was met at the gate by Miss Marple, who had returned early under the pretext of retrieving a borrowed sewing pattern, though, in truth, she found it difficult to stay away. She had brought a wicker basket with her, containing a jar of quince jelly and a set of embroidery she'd pretended to misplace. The constable greeted her with the mix of courtesy and vague discomfort that many young men offered elderly women, who somehow always seemed to be 5 steps ahead of them. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Just having a look round per protocol?" "Very sensible," she replied, stepping aside. "It's always best to begin with the environment, don't you think? People are more honest in their homes than in their words." He blinked. "I suppose that's true." Inside, the cottage was just as she had left it 2 days prior, orderly, still, too still. The bent sewing needle, the missing thimble, the open sewing tin. Constable Rowan noted them all, though without her particular lens of observation. "No sign of a break-in," he muttered. "Doors not damaged, windows locked. No valuables missing." "And yet Miss Jedge is gone," Miss Marple said gently, "and not even a note left to explain it." The constable scratched his head. "Perhaps she left voluntarily?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not without her handbag. It's still hanging in the hall. Purse inside, her knitting too. I should think if she were leaving by choice, she'd have brought her reading glasses at the very least." Rowan frowned. "But no blood, no sign of a struggle. Everything's neat as a pin." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the empty armchair beside the sewing table. "Yes, almost too neat." They walked through the bedroom next. The bed had been made with hospital precision. A book lay on the knitstandess of the D'Urbervilles, open to chapter 15, with a pressed flower tucked between the pages. A habit of Isabel's, she collected wildflowers and dried them in her books. Miss Marple made a mental note. In the kitchen, a loaf of bread had gone slightly stale on the counter. It had been sliced once, the end crust left untouched. A pot of honey beside it remained open, its surface crystallizing. All small things, but people lived in small things. They revealed themselves in the details of their habits. As they moved back into the sitting room, Rowan sighed. "Suppose we ask around next." "Neighbors, anyone who might have seen something," Miss Marple nodded. "Begin with those who saw her last, and those who expected to see her but didn't. Disruptions in routine are often more revealing than direct observations." Rowan smiled faintly. "You ought to wear the uniform, Miss Marple," she chuckled. "Oh, no, dear boy. That would give the game away." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk down Elm Row, where a row of terraced cottages stood back, from the lane behind low hedges. It was here that Mrs. Ada Fawcett lived, Isabel's nearest neighbor and possibly the most dedicated window watcher in the village. Her sitting room faced Jedge Cottage directly and had a view of the front gate and garden path. Miss Marple tapped lightly at the door and was welcomed in with enthusiasm. "Oh, I've been dying for someone to ask," Mrs. Fawcett said, ushering her inside with theatrical urgency. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the lavender basket on its side. That woman never left anything out, not even a pair of gloves. And did you see anything unusual that day? "Well," she said, lowering her voice, "there was something. Late Friday afternoon, must have been around 5, I saw a man at her back door. Middle-aged, dark coat, looked anxious. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I thought he looked familiar. He was only there a moment. Then he disappeared down the garden path." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did he go inside?" "I believe he did." "The door opened. She let him in. And after that?" "Nothing. No one came in or out after that. I was watching till after dark. That's when I got suspicious. No lamp lit in her parlor. She always reads in the evening." "Did you mention this to the constable?" "I told my cousin, who told Mr. Benson, who I think passed it on." "But you know how things get muddled." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've been very helpful, Ada." As she left, Miss Marple's mind turned over the details. A male visitor, recognized but not quite placed. Let in, not forced. A change in routine after his visit. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to suggest that whoever came to Jedge Cottage that evening didn't just pass through. He changed the course of something. The next person Miss Marple visited was a Woodcroft, a spinster of prickly temperament and an erratic history with Miss Jedge. Once close friends years ago, by all accounts the two had fallen out over something neither had ever explained, though Eliza referred to it vaguely as a betrayal of trust. She lived in a small, lopsided house at the top of Crofters Hill and was known for keeping cats and secrets in equal number. "Gone, is she?" Eliza said when Miss Marple broached the subject. She didn't seem surprised. "You don't seem particularly unsettled," Miss Marple said mildly. "Oh, I've seen things coming for years," Eliza replied, drawing a shawl tightly around her shoulders. Isabel liked to pretend she was above the fray, but she had enemies like anyone else. People forget that. "Did you see her recently?" Eliza looked out the window, then back. "Not for a month or two, not since—" "Well, that doesn't matter, but it might." The older woman's jaw tensed. "We disagreed about something personal. A letter she'd sent years ago that I only discovered last spring. It changed how I saw her. I won't speak ill of the vanished, but let's just say she wasn't the saint people made her out to be." Miss Marple left shortly after, her mind not on the bitterness of Eliza's tone, but on one phrase, a letter sent years ago. What correspondence, she wondered, had been important enough to spark a falling out and secret enough to remain buried? Until now? That evening, as twilight stretched its long fingers across the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, listening to the grandfather clock tick gently. She had filled a small note card with fragments. Spool of ivory thread in the grass, missing thimble, unfinished wedding gown, male visitor. Unaccounted for a letter that caused a rift. Eliza's cryptic reference to betrayal. None of it formed a clear picture yet, but it was not in Miss Marple's nature to rush. She let the pieces rest, allowing memory and instinct to do their slow, invisible work. Outside, the village grew quiet again. But in her mind, the needle was threading its way through the truth, one hidden stitch at a time. Chapter 4. First suspects. Word count. Approximately 1,180 by Tuesday morning. The mood in St. Mildred's had shifted again. The initial excitement, the thrill of mystery, the novelty of something actually happening had dulled into something more somber. Isabel Jedge had now been missing for 3 full days, and even the most imaginative villagers could no longer pretend. She might simply walk back into her cottage with a flushed apology and a suitcase full of good excuses. The local constable had begun knocking on doors with increasing urgency, asking more pointed questions and jotting down names in his pocket notebook. But as often happened in these matters, it was not the police who truly understood the village. It was the villagers themselves, and more precisely, one villager in particular. Miss Marple, seated as usual by her lace-curtained window with a cup of weak tea and an embroidery hoop in her lap, had already begun narrowing her list. She was not interested in lurid theories. She cared little for dramatics. She wanted to know who had reason not merely to dislike Isabel Gedge, but to fear what she knew. And in that quiet space between gossip and silence, she began to see the outlines of motive. The first name that had surfaced with any frequency in whispers was Gordon Trent, a local handyman with a questionable past and a temper known to flare after too many pints at the Wheatsheaf. He had worked on Gedge Cottage 6 months ago, repairing roof tiles and regrouting the front path. By most accounts, they'd gotten along well enough until they didn't. "Something went wrong with the invoice," said Mrs. Holloway, always happy to relay conflict with an air of sanctified concern. He accused her of shorting him. She accused him of charging twice for the same job. Voices were raised, doors slammed. You know, the type barely housebroken. Miss Marple had spoken to Gordon herself once or twice, but she found his belligerence more defensive than sinister. Still, he remained on the list. It wasn't uncommon for arguments over money to escalate, and more than one seemingly harmless. Handyman had proven dangerous under pressure. When she encountered him outside the hardware shop that morning, she took the opportunity. "Good morning, Mr. Trent," she said mildly, nodding at his paint-splattered overalls. He grunted in reply, loading planks into the back of his van. "Terrible business about Miss Gedge," she added softly. His shoulders stiffened. "Don't know anything about it," he said too quickly. "Haven't been near her place in weeks. She was always sharp with her tongue, that one. Thinks everyone's out to cheat her. Oh, I'm sure she simply had high standards," Miss Marple replied, her tone pleasant. Gordon slammed the van door shut. "People disappear all the time. Maybe she finally got tired of all you lot sticking your noses in her business." He drove off before she could respond. Miss Marple remained on the pavement, watching the trail of dust his van left behind. A man like Gordon was easy to suspect. Too easy, perhaps. The second person to catch her attention did so by virtue of his conspicuous silence, Edmund Killeen, the schoolmaster. Killeen was a precise, cautious man in his 40s with a waxed mustache and a fondness for order. He lived alone, kept to himself, and walked the same loop each morning at precisely 7:15 a.m. His punctuality was such that the baker's boy claimed he could set his wristwatch by Killeen's passing. But something about him nagged at Miss Marple, perhaps his sudden reluctance to speak about Isabel at all. "I barely knew the woman," he told the constable brusquely when questioned. "She was a tradesperson. I never had cause to engage her services," which was technically true. But Miss Marple remembered seeing Killeen emerge from Gedge Cottage one evening last winter, scarf pulled high around his face, hands thrust deep in his pockets. She had thought little of it then. He could have been dropping something off, asking directions, or attending to a tear in a coat. But now the memory resurfaced with unease. When she later asked him casually about his whereabouts, on Friday evening his answer was even odder. "I was home," he said flatly, "grading essays." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "And the essays, were they satisfactory?" He blinked. "Mediocre, as usual." She nodded once and changed the subject. But inwardly she noted that someone who lied often gave less detail, not more. Killeen had provided just enough information to appear forthcoming, never a comforting sign. Then there was Miss Charlotte Gedge, a niece of Isabel's from Oxford, who arrived in the village late Tuesday afternoon, summoned by the vicar's letter. She was a tall woman in her early 30s, with high cheekbones, a tightly pinned chignon, and a clipped voice that spoke of boarding schools and emotional restraint. "I'm not entirely surprised," she said upon arrival. "My aunt has always had a dramatic streak. She used to claim she had enemies. I never took it seriously." Miss Marple took tea with her at the vicarage and studied her closely. Charlotte had only met with Isabel occasionally on holidays or to discuss family matters. And yet she seemed more vexed than distressed. Did she ever speak of anyone threatening her? Miss Marple asked gently. No, Charlotte said, stirring her tea briskly. She mostly complained about her clients. She had a very specific view of the world. Saw and salt where none was meant. Miss Marple leaned back. She never mentioned a letter? Or a secret that might come to light? Charlotte's spoon paused briefly in the cup. She was very private. She didn't confide in me. A pity. She seems to have been keeping something very important to herself. Charlotte looked away, yes, and look where that's landed her. It was not the coldness of the response that struck Miss Marple, it was the calculation. Charlotte was choosing her words too carefully, and while her detachment could be grief, it could, just as easily, be self-protection. By evening, Miss Marple's list of suspects had begun to take form. Not because she believed any one of them had acted violently out of impulse, but because each had something to hide. Gordon Trent, the angry workman. Edmund Killeen, the private schoolmaster. Charlotte Jedge, the guarded niece. And, of course, Eliza Woodcroft, whose past with Isabel remained murky and unresolved. None of them felt right. But they all felt wrong in some essential human way. The question was no longer who disliked Isabel Jedge. The question was, who feared what she might do next? That night, as the village once again settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the fire, knitting slowly, a pair of soft gray socks taking shape on her needles. The house was quiet, save for the distant ticking of the hall clock. She thought of the missing thimble again. Such a small thing, almost laughably so. But for a woman like Isabel Jedge, who measured life in fine stitches and perfect seams, it was as telling as a scream in the dark. The answer, Miss Marple felt certain, would not come from physical evidence or sudden confessions. It would come from human nature, from the slow unraveling of old secrets, long held and never quite forgotten. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. Word. Count. Approximately 1,180. The morning light in St. Mildred's broke through the mist with the pale determination of early autumn. A fine silver fog hung over the hedgerows, and dew clung to garden gates and iron railings. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, her mind occupied with the previous day's observations. The tea kettle whistled softly as she set out her tray. With methodical hands, 1 sugar, no milk, marmalade on toast, and a small notepad beside the plate. The thimble remained a peculiar irritant in her mind. A thimble, after all, was not something a seamstress lost lightly. She had known women for whom a particular thimble was practically an heirloom, fitted perfectly to the pad of the finger, worn smooth over decades. That Isabel Jedge would misplace hers, let alone allow it to disappear without comment, was improbable in the extreme, which made its absence all the more significant. By mid-morning, Miss Marple made her way to the rear garden of Jedge Cottage. Constable Sims was at the gate, chewing on a toothpick with an air of idleness that suggested the investigation was already losing momentum. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, brightening. "I doubt there's much to see, but you're welcome. To have a look? We've already combed the house. No signs of struggle. No signs of packing, no note. It's like she vanished into thin air." Miss Marple gave a gracious nod. "Might I step into the sewing room just for a moment?" Sims hesitated only, slightly before motioning her through. "Just don't touch anything, ma'am. We're still sorting through it." Inside, the air was stale. The curtains remained drawn. Light filtered in through the lace like pale shadows. The sewing machine still sat on the corner desk, its wheel slightly askew, as though it had last been used in a hurry. The fabric pinned on the mannequin was a half-finished evening dress in navy blue silk, elegant, understated. There was a frayed edge along the hem, unfinished. Miss Marple moved slowly about the room, taking in the details others had overlooked. The waste bin was still full, with snippets of thread and discarded scraps. But it was the work table beside the machine that drew her attention. A tray of sewing tools had been nudged just out of alignment, needles, pins, a tomato-shaped pincushion, a small box of buttons. And there, beside the spools of thread, sat an empty thimble case. A velvet-lined oval box, open, hollow. She did not touch it. Instead, she leaned forward, observing the dust patterns. A faint impression where the thimble had once sat was still visible, but more curious than the absence was something else, a single short length of red thread caught on the hinge of the box. It wasn't frayed. It hadn't been cut cleanly. Either it looked snapped, as if broken in haste. Miss Marple's brow furrowed, red thread. The half-finished dress on the mannequin was navy blue. There were no other red garments in progress, so what had the red thread been used for? Later, that day she found herself in the company of Eliza Woodcroft, the baker's widow who had known Isabel longer than most. They sat together on a weathered bench near the green, watching geese wander lazily through the fallen leaves. Miss Marple offered her a wrapped scone, which Eliza accepted with a tired smile. She was a hard woman to love, our Isabel, Eliza admitted, but I dare say she was cleverer than most. Cleverness can be a lonely thing, Miss Marple replied softly. Did she ever confide in you about anything troubling lately? Something she feared? Eliza hesitated, biting into the scone. She did mention something odd the last time we spoke. Said she thought someone had been in her cottage while she was out. Miss Marple's head tilted. Did she say what? Had been taken? No, she was vague. Just said she found her bedroom drawer slightly open, and that she'd been missing a skein of red embroidery silk. Red, the color returned like a thread through her mind. Miss Marple offered a nonchalant smile. Red's a difficult shade to match. Perhaps it was needed by someone. Desperate, Eliza shrugged. She said it wasn't the loss that bothered her. It was the idea someone had touched her things. Isabel was very possessive of her belongings, especially her sewing tools. A shame she didn't mention the missing thimble. Eliza's eyes widened slightly. The silver one, with the fleur-de-lis. That was her favorite. She always said it belonged to her grandmother. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It's missing from the case. That gave Eliza pause. She looked down at her lap, then back up. That's not like her, not at all. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Charlotte Jedge, wearing gloves and a sharply cut brown coat, arrived at the vicarage ostensibly to discuss her aunt's affairs. She didn't leave a will, as far as I know, Charlotte said briskly, folding and unfolding her gloves. Though, I expect the house falls to the family by default. There aren't many of us. Miss Marple sat opposite her, tea between them, eyes gently watchful. And you believe she simply wandered off? Charlotte's jaw tensed. I believe. She may have had a breakdown. She lived alone. People in the village didn't always treat her kindly. Sometimes isolation offers more clarity than company, Miss Marple said. Did she ever speak to you of unfinished business? Letters and old scandal, perhaps? Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Why would she do that? Oh, I suppose. She wouldn't, unless she believed someone had come back from the past. Charlotte set down her cup too sharply. I think you enjoy this, Miss Marple. Poking around, making a game of it. Miss Marple's face remained placid. Not a game, dear, just patterns. I find human behavior repeats itself like stitches in a hem. Charlotte stood abruptly. If you find any legal documents among her things, I would appreciate being notified. She left with clipped heels echoing down the vicarage steps. Miss Marple did not follow her. Instead, she stared at the red tulips on the tea china, letting silence settle again. So much heat under so controlled a surface. Miss Jedge's niece was not telling everything she knew. That evening, Miss Marple visited the rectory again, where the Reverend Calhoun had been helping sort through Isabel's papers. The living room was filled with a tidy chaos of half-filled boxes and manila folders. Nothing of obvious importance had emerged. She was meticulous, the Reverend admitted, handing Miss Marple a small journal with cracked binding. This is the only thing remotely personal. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside were fabric measurements, client names, sketch, patterns, and tucked into the back, a folded slip of paper. On it were just 2 lines in Isabel Jedge's angular handwriting. The red thread always leads to the needle, and needles, when misused, can draw blood. Miss Marple read it twice, then closed the book. The seamstress had left a clue after all, not with loud declarations, but with a whisper hidden among her work. Something had frightened her, and she had tried to record it the only way she knew how, with metaphor, stitch, and rhyme. The question now was, who had followed the red thread? And had it led them to murder? Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Word count. Approximately 1,180. A fine drizzle veiled St. Mildred's the following morning, softening the crisp outlines of its Tudor buildings and settling into the cobblestones like a memory reluctant to leave. The weather, like the village, felt suspended in a moment of quiet tension, as though it, too, were waiting for something to break. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully at the village tea-room, the cup's gentle clink a contrast to the unease. In her thoughts, Isabel Gedge had not simply vanished. She had left behind Echo's half-finished work, a missing thimble, and a cryptic note that hinted at danger. And now Charlotte Gedge's visit had added a layer of frost to the situation. The woman had been too tightly wound, too quick to deflect. Her words had been careful, but her hands had betrayed her. Clenching, twitching, tugging at the seams of her composure, Miss Marple never overlooked such things. She looked up as the bell above the door jingled. Edwin Carruthers, the local solicitor, entered with his usual sense of hairy dignity, removing his hat and brushing off the rain as though affronted it dared to fall on him. "Miss Marple," he said with a brief nod, "mind if I join you?" "Please do, Mr. Carruthers." He settled into the seat opposite. "I've just come from Gedge Cottage. The constables requested that I help oversee the inventory of Miss Gedge's belongings. Rather premature, if you ask me. We've not yet established that she's, gone." Miss Marple stirred her tea again. "Presumed missing, yes. But in cases where foul play is suspected, even implicitly the law must begin to prepare?" Carruthers gave a grunt of agreement. "Odd woman, but sharp. Did her own legal paperwork, Kept everything in immaculate order. Never needed my services, much to my irritation." Miss Marple allowed a faint smile. "I suspect she liked her affairs private, particularly where family was concerned." He leaned in, voice lowered. "Speaking of which, her niece has wasted no time. Came to my office this morning demanding access to the cottage keys. Said she intended to preserve family property. I reminded her no legal inheritance can be assumed without a will or death certificate." "Did she take it well?" he snorted. "Like vinegar in a wound." Miss Marple filed this away. Charlotte's urgency was beginning to border on desperation. Back in her own sitting room, Miss Marple opened the small notebook again, the one Isabel had kept near her sewing station. It was mostly mundane appointments, fabric orders, names she recognized from the village. But nestled between the pages was something pressed flower, brittle and browned. A red carnation. Not a rose, nor lavender, which Miss Gedge often grew, but a carnation. She recalled something now weeks ago, before the disappearance. Miss Gedge had come to church wearing a brooch with a small silk carnation on her coat. Odd, Miss Marple had thought at the time. It wasn't her usual taste. Too sentimental, too loud, and now this flower. She rang up the vicarage. "Reverend Calhoun," she said kindly, "I wonder if I might trouble you with a small request. Do you recall the flower arrangements from the last few Sundays?" "Oh, yes," he answered readily. "We alternate the altar flowers every week. Mrs. Dalrymple takes great pride in it." "Why?" I was curious whether red carnations had been used recently. A pause. "Well, now that you mention it, yes, 2 Sundays ago." "A rather unorthodox choice. We rarely use red seams too bold for our chapel, you understand. But Mrs. Dalrymple insisted. Said someone had donated them anonymously." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Thank you, Reverend. That's quite helpful." The flower hadn't come from Isabel's garden. It had been sent left, a message perhaps, or a signature. And now it was pressed between her notes, as though she had saved it for a reason. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way once more to Gedge Cottage. The constable had stepped out, and a single uniformed officer stood watch at the gate, barely acknowledging her. She was expected by now. Inside, the place remained largely untouched. The sewing room was still cordoned off, but the living room held the strong scent of old books and faded lavender. Miss Marple moved quietly, studying the space. On a small side table sat a framed photograph. Isabel, younger by perhaps a decade, standing beside a man with severe features, tall, narrow-eyed, with a slight military bearing. The frame was worn around the edges as though often handled. She examined the back. Faint ink inscription, to IG with resolve CH. No date, no location. CH. She would ask around, discreetly, a glance through the sitting room. Window caught a figure crossing the path. Charlotte Jedge. Miss Marple straightened her cardigan and stepped out to greet her. "Miss Jedge," she called gently. Charlotte turned, clearly startled. Her coat was buttoned tight, despite the mild afternoon. "You again. Are you always lurking about?" "I find myself drawn to puzzles," Miss Marple said with soft humor. "And your aunt seems to have left one behind." Charlotte sighed, weary. "Do you believe she's still alive?" "I believe she expected something, possibly someone. Enough to hide clues, however cryptic. Did she ever mention a man? Someone from her past, perhaps military?" Charlotte froze for a moment too long. "No," she said finally. "She lived alone for a reason. Men only complicated her life." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Sometimes it's not men who complicate things, but secrets." Charlotte's face hardened. "Look, I don't know what you're implying, but my aunt was private, yes. Suspicious, maybe, but not the sort to attract drama. She was a seamstress. She hemmed curtains." Miss Marple said nothing for a beat. Then, "Have you ever hemmed a garment, Miss Jedge?" Charlotte looked confused. "Of course not." Then you wouldn't know that some women especially, those who are clever, hide things in hems, letters, notes, even jewelry. You see, when thread and needle are second nature, the fabric becomes one's diary." Charlotte's mouth opened slightly, then shut again. "I need to go." She turned and walked briskly away, her heels clicking like a clock running out of time. That evening, Miss Marple hosted a small gathering at her cottage, just tea and biscuits, though she'd invited Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, and Horace Long, the retired librarian. Neither knew the other had information she needed. But over sponge cake and polite conversation, the truth emerged. Mrs. Weatherby, with a slight tip of her glasses, said, "You know, someone posted a letter from Jedge Cottage the day before. She vanished. I remember because it bore an old Army regiment stamp, the kind they don't make anymore." "Odd," Horace added. "You mention Army. There was a man asking about Miss Jedge at the library not long ago. Tall, thin fellow. Wanted old newspaper records from the war years. Said he was looking up an old friend." Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. The threads were coming together now. Letters, flowers, a name with initials CH, and a man from the past who'd returned, asking questions. Miss Jedge had sensed she was in danger. Not from a stranger, but from someone she once knew well. And like a good seamstress, she had tried to stitch a warning into the very seams of her life. But had it come too late? Chapter 7. The Man In. The photograph word count, approximately 1,170. Morning fog clung stubbornly to the hedgerows of St. Mildred's as Miss Marple walked briskly toward the village library. Though the streets were quiet, she sensed an undercurrent humming just beneath the surface, a tension that had begun when Isabel Jedge vanished, and which now seemed to ripple outward through every conversation, every sideways glance. The village was a loom, and someone had pulled a thread loose. The photograph in Isabel's sitting room had troubled her all evening. The man beside Isabel, stern-faced, distant, and precise, did not smile. His posture was erect, his eyes focused not on the camera, but just beyond it, as if studying something only he could see. The inscription had been telling, too. To IG, with resolve, CH. Now she intended to put a name to those initials. The library was still unlocking its doors when she arrived, and Horace Long, who'd grown increasingly helpful since the previous night's tea, waved her in with a conspiratorial smile. "I've pulled a few old issues of the West Sussex Sentinel, just in case you wanted to review wartime mentions of our dear Miss Jedge," he said, gesturing to a stack of bound editions. "Though I confess there's not much from that era. In terms of society news." Miss Marple thanked him and settled into a corner near the tall windows. The morning light filtered through the glass in ribbons, and soon she was leafing through the yellowed pages of a newspaper from 1943. It wasn't until she reached the issue dated November 19th that her finger paused. A small column in the bottom corner read, "Local hero awarded military commendation Captain Charles Hesketh of the Royal Engineers. Recently returned on convalescent leave, has been recognized for acts of bravery during the evacuation of civilian forces from occupied France. Captain Hesketh, whose family resides in Sussex, will remain in the region for medical recovery." The accompanying photo was grainy but unmistakable. The same man from Isabel's photograph. So, he wasn't merely an acquaintance, he was a war hero. But why had Isabel kept the photo so close? And why had she never spoken of him, not even to her closest acquaintances? Most women, especially in that generation, held on to such things for deeply personal reasons, a love affair, perhaps. But Miss Marple had come to trust absence more than presence. Isabel hadn't framed him. Among other friends or family only alone, hidden in a seldom dusted corner. This wasn't nostalgia. It was a warning. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the post office under the pretense of sending a letter. Mrs. Weatherby, ever vigilant behind the counter, lit up when she saw her. "Back again, Miss Marple? You've been busy this week." "I've been unusually social," Miss Marple smiled. "And curious. You mentioned the army envelope posted from Jedge Cottage? I wondered, would you happen to recall the name it was addressed to?" Mrs. Weatherby frowned, tapping her chin. "It's bending the rules, but seeing as the case involves the constable." Now, she bent below the counter and pulled out her notebook. "Here it is, Major Charles Hesketh, posted to a lodging house in Eastbourne. Bit of a rare name, so I remember thinking it odd. Eastbourne, so he was still in the country and reachable." Miss Marple thanked her kindly and left the post office with her mind spinning. The name, the flower, the photograph Hesketh was at the center of it all, but was he seeking reconciliation? Or revenge? That evening, a quiet knock came at Miss Marple's door. To her surprise, it was Constable Dennis, not in uniform but looking uneasy, almost flushed. "May I come in?" "Miss Marple? Of course, dear boy." He entered, not meeting her eye until they were both seated. "I've just returned from interviewing Charlotte Jedge again." "Something she said. I thought you should know." "Yes?" "She mentioned that her aunt had recently been corresponding with someone from her past." Sighed, she found old letters. Tucked away in Isabel's sewing bureau. Burned most of them, she claimed. Thought it best to leave the past buried. But she described the signature. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And yet she claimed this morning not to know of any such man." Dennis looked pained. "I thought so too." "She's hiding something. But it's not enough too. Arrest on, at least not yet." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It isn't. Also," he continued, "we found something else in the cottage garden, buried in the soil beneath the trellis. A small silver object. Tarnished, but recognizable." He handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside lay a thimble, silver, engraved on the inside rim. Miss Marple's breath caught as she read the inscription. "To IG, with all my patience." Her fingers traced the letters. "The same initials? Another signature from Hesketh?" "Dennis," continued, "we're not sure why it was buried or who buried it. But it was hidden deliberately." "Isabel wouldn't bury her own tools," Miss Marple murmured. "Especially not one with sentiment. She must have feared it would be found. Or worse," she added, "feared who might find it." By mid-morning the next day, Miss Marple took the early train to Eastbourne, a trip she rarely made but one she now deemed necessary. The lodging house, located off the main promenade, had a small brass plaque that read The White Pines. Rooms let weekly. Inside, the landlady, a thin woman with restless eyes, confirmed a Mr. Hesketh resided on the second floor. "I believe he's in just now. Shall I announce you?" "No, thank you," said Miss Marple. "I should like to surprise him. It is, after all, a personal visit." The climb to the second floor was slow, the stairs creaking beneath her. Careful step, she reached room 3 and knocked. A moment later, the door opened. The man who answered was older than the photograph suggested, though not by much. His back was still straight, his eyes still focused just past her shoulder. His military presence had not diminished with age. "Captain Hesketh?" she asked gently. He blinked, surprised. "Yes, and you are—" "My name is Jane Marple. I come from St. Mildred's." He stiffened slightly. She continued, "You knew a woman there, Miss Isabel Jedge." A pause. A flicker in the eyes. "I did. She is missing." Now he looked directly at her. "I know. You received the letter?" "No," he said quietly. "I didn't have to. I knew the moment she didn't respond to mine." Miss Marple studied him. "Might I come in?" He stepped aside, allowing her entrance into a modest room, plain, sparse but tidy. On the desk lay envelopes, letters with stamps, one addressed in a firm, looping hand. She picked it up. "You wrote her recently?" He nodded. "I tried. I shouldn't have. We ended badly. Long ago. But I thought she should know certain things." "What sort of things, Captain?" But his gaze dropped. "I think she knew too much, or remembered something she shouldn't have. And now, I fear, I was too late." Miss Marple looked at him, her mind racing. Something had been set in motion long before Isabel vanished. And now, with Hesketh's return, the past was beginning to bleed into the present. Chapter 8. The Letter That Never Arrived. Word count. Approximately 1,180 rain. Traced narrow paths down the pane of Captain Hesketh's window as Miss Marple stood still, the unspoken weight of the room pressing inward like fog. The letter addressed to Isabel. Set between them on the desk, unopened, slightly yellowed at the corners, a message never posted. "She never received this?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but precise. Captain Hesketh gave a small shake of his head. "I wrote it a month ago, meant to send it. Carried it about with me. But in the end, I suppose I was afraid—" "Of what?" His gaze shifted to the rain-slicked window. "Of disturbing a grave too long buried." There was a silence, heavy and not altogether comfortable. Miss Marple allowed it to stretch. Just far enough before speaking again. "She kept your photograph, hidden away." His eyes turned sharply to hers. "Did she?" "It wasn't framed," she added, "but preserved. Tucked behind a sewing tin, where only the owner would go often enough to see it and remember." He said nothing at first, but his shoulders sagged just slightly. That was her way, I suppose. Quiet sentiment, deep loyalty, and a profound instinct for discretion. "You once meant a great deal to her. We were engaged," he said at last. "Briefly, during the war, in the weeks between my recovery and redeployment. But it didn't last. Why not?" She broke it off, he replied, eyes flickering. "Said I had changed." She was right. I had. War does that to a man, makes you cautious, secretive, sometimes even cruel. Miss Marple watched him closely. "Yet you kept her letters." "Everyone," he murmured. "Even when I couldn't bring myself to answer them, they were a kind of compass, a reminder, a pause." Then he added, "And now she's gone without a trace." Miss Marple folded her hands, her voice firm. "You said she remembered something she shouldn't have. What did you mean?" He hesitated. "In one of her last letters," he said, opening a small tin from the drawer and removing a folded page, "she mentioned something, an old name, a place, and a question one she shouldn't have asked." He passed the page to her. The paper trembled in his hand. Miss Marple took it and began to read. "Dearest Charles, I came across an old photo from Le Havre, the name Montreux scribbled on the back. You never told me what really happened that night, when the train was delayed and you were gone for 4 hours. I didn't think to ask then. But now, I wonder, so many years later, do you still remember it the way I do, or differently?" Beneath the letter, Miss Marple saw a faint stain ink smudged by a tear or perhaps the weather. "I hadn't thought about Montreux in decades," Hesketh said grimly. "It was a border post outside Le Havre in 1943. During our evacuation efforts, it served as an informal way station. Soldiers and refugees passed through it in the chaos. But not everyone who passed was meant to be there." Miss Marple said nothing, waiting. There was an intelligence officer among us, he went on, a man who later disappeared. Just vanished. Rumors floated afterward: betrayal, sabotage, maybe even a switch in identity. I was questioned, of course, briefly, but nothing came of it. We were all too exhausted to remember clearly. Or so they said. And Isabel? Miss Marple asked. How was she involved? She wasn't, not directly. But I told her things, small confidences, half-thought suspicions. And I suspect she remembered every word. A long breath filled the room. Miss Marple finally spoke. You believe she may have uncovered something about that betrayal? I believe someone thought she had, he corrected. She mentioned in that same letter that she'd been followed on her way back from the train station, that she heard footsteps, that she found her front door unlatched one evening, though she was sure she'd locked it. Did she mention it to the police? No, she had always believed in handling small troubles on her own. She wasn't a woman easily frightened. Miss Marple nodded. She was, however, deeply observant, more than most. Captain. Hesketh leaned forward. You think whoever came back for her had been watching all along? I think, Miss Marple replied, her voice tight, that someone close to her, perhaps in this village, knew exactly what she remembered, and what she could uncover if she put all the pieces together. He looked startled. You mean someone local? Isn't that always the case? She said, almost sadly. These crimes don't arrive with strangers. They begin at home small. Resentments, old wounds, unfinished business. The past doesn't just return, it lingers, like dust in the corners. She rose to leave. Hesketh stood with her. What will you do now? I'll return to St. Mildred's, she said, gathering her coat, and ask one more question. The right one, this time, he nodded, and if I can help? You already have. Back in St. Mildred's, dusk painted the fields in lavender and ash. The gaslights along High Street flickered to life as Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. The Reverend Graham Everley had served the village for 20 years, and while he was not always the most observant in secular matters, he had a firm memory for names, dates, and village family histories. He welcomed her warmly and offered tea, which she declined. I won't stay long, she said gently. I only need one name. Do you recall, in your records or memory, anyone else in the village who may have once served in France during the war? He thought a moment. A handful. But most were stationed elsewhere. Let's see. Thomas Weir was with the Navy. Mr. Wembley served as an engineer. Yes, and then there's Charlotte Jedge's father. Odd sort, died a few years back. Miss Marple stiffened. Charlotte's father? Yes. Randolph Jedge, civilian clerk officially, but I always suspected there was more to him. Spoke French fluently. And he once told me, perhaps too freely, that his war record was sealed for good reason. Did he ever mention Montreux? The vicar frowned. Now that you mention it, yes. In a sermon anecdote, of all things. Recounting how unexpected moments could change one's path forever. He said something like, a foggy night in Montreux taught me never to trust the obvious, odd fellow. Always slightly theatrical, Miss Marple thanked him. As she left the vicarage and stepped out into the darkening evening, she felt the air grow colder around her, not from the wind. Randolph Jedge, Isabel's brother-in-law, deceased now, but he'd lived in that cottage for years before Charlotte inherited it. And if he had known what happened in Montreux, or worse, been involved, then perhaps Isabel had stumbled upon more than memories. Perhaps she had found something or someone connected to her own family. And that meant Charlotte Jedge wasn't just hiding secrets, she might be guarding them. Chapter 9. Threads in the attic word count. Approximately 1,180 the next morning, the village of St. Mildred's awoke under a low sky, the clouds stretched taut like gray wool waiting to be spun. Miss Marple, teacup in hand, stared out the sitting-room window of her modest cottage, her thoughts weaving tighter with every silent moment. She had been replaying Randolph Jedge's name in her mind since the previous evening. His presence hovered at the edges of everything, the family ties to Charlotte, the hidden war past, the Montreux reference. All tenuous threads, yet none fully unraveled? Not yet. At 9 sharp she set out. She made a point of stopping by the village grocer to exchange a few pleasantries with Mrs. Fortenberry, and to inquire after the state of the tomatoes. Then, without undue urgency but with clear intention, she turned up the road toward Lavender Cottage. Charlotte Jedge had not returned since the inspector's interview. The cottage sat quietly beneath an overgrowth of ivy, its windows shuttered and the curtains drawn. But Miss Marple had known Charlotte's routine since childhood, and she knew when the house was merely unoccupied, and when it was avoiding being seen. Charlotte was inside. Miss Marple knocked, politely but firmly. A minute passed. Then two, finally the latch turned. Charlotte stood in the doorway, eyes narrowed. "Miss Marple, how unexpected. I thought I might return your knitting pattern," Miss Marple said gently, holding up a folded page. "You left it at the Women's Circle 2 weeks ago." Charlotte hesitated. "I don't believe I meant to," Miss Marple interrupted, her smile undiminished. "One seldom does." With visible reluctance, Charlotte stepped aside. The interior of Lavender Cottage had always been immaculately kept, but today Miss Marple noticed dust along the skirting boards and unopened mail stacked neatly on a tray. The smell of stale tea lingered in the air, a hint of long hours passed in solitude. Charlotte gestured toward the parlor, but did not sit. "You've been quiet since Isabel's disappearance," Miss Marple said carefully. "I've had nothing to contribute," Charlotte replied, arms folded. "And the inspector made his view of me quite clear." Miss Marple studied her face. "You were close once." Charlotte looked away. "That was many years ago." "Still," Miss Marple went on, "you must have had memories? Shared secrets, silences, things only sisters can carry?" A muscle twitched near Charlotte's jaw. "We weren't that kind of close. It was the bitterness, not grief, not fear, but something older, more rusted." Miss Marple took a breath. "I spoke to Captain Hesketh." Charlotte's face turned sharply. "Oh?" "He told me about Montreux." A pause, then, with forced indifference, "That was Father's station, wasn't it? During the war." "Indeed." "But not his only station, it seems. He passed through Le Havre, didn't he?" "I couldn't say." "But Isabel could." Charlotte's composure cracked for a fleeting second, just long enough. Miss Marple stepped closer. "Your father kept journals, letters. I imagine many are still in this house." Charlotte's gaze flicked toward the staircase. Miss Marple followed it. "In the attic?" Silence. Miss Marple folded her hands. "I don't need to see them." "Not unless you think there's something in them that might explain why your sister vanished without a sound. Why her sewing machine was found untouched. Why her cup of tea was still warm when no one saw her leave." Charlotte turned her back, walking to the hearth. "I told her to leave it alone," she said quietly. "I told her to stop poking around." "So she did find something," Miss Marple said. "An old box," Charlotte admitted. "Hidden beneath a floorboard father once told her never to open. But she was always the clever one. She remembered. She pried it loose a month ago. What was inside?" Charlotte looked pale. "Correspondence, military files, code names. A photo of a man I didn't recognize, but she did." "Missa." Marple said nothing, allowing the silence to draw truth from Charlotte. "She said she was going to send it somewhere," Charlotte whispered. "To a contact, not the police, someone else. A name she wouldn't give me. She said she wanted to confirm something before causing a stir." Miss Marple's mind turned back to the inspector's mention of a missing parcel at the post office, unclaimed, unsent. "She trusted me," Charlotte went on bitterly, "even when I didn't want her to." Miss Marple's eyes were soft. "So you hid the box?" "I hid it because I was scared," Charlotte snapped. "Because Father's shadow stretched longer than any of us realized. Because some things should never be dug up." Miss Marple didn't press. Instead she said, "Then tell me, when was the last time you saw her?" Charlotte sat down, finally, folding in on herself. 3 nights before she vanished. She came by with cinnamon rolls. Said she was close to understanding something. That she finally knew why Father insisted we leave the war behind. "And did she say anything else?" Charlotte hesitated. She said, "If anything happens to me, check the pocket of the blue coat in my sewing room." Miss Marple straightened. "You didn't tell the police that. They wouldn't have believed me." Miss Marple rose. "Then may I see it now?" The sewing room still bore the quiet weight of its owner. Dust had not yet settled across the tools. The blue coat hung neatly on a hook, seemingly untouched. Charlotte watched from the door as Miss Marple reached into the pocket. There, folded tightly and worn at the edges, was a train stub dated 3 weeks earlier, stamped with a small French town's name Beaumont-sur-Lac and pinned to it a note in Isabel's elegant script. "He wasn't who he said he was. But I finally know who was behind Montreux. Everything leads to the lake." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "Did she ever mention that town to you?" Charlotte shook her head. But Miss Marple already knew. Beaumont-sur-Lac had been a checkpoint on the border near Montreux used by intelligence operatives during the final years of the war. It was no place for a civilian, and yet somehow Isabel had traced someone there. Someone who might still be watching. She tucked the note into her handbag. "This," she said quietly, "changes everything." Outside, the wind picked up and rain began to fall again, soft and slow, like the past quietly reasserting itself. Miss Marple stood at the threshold of Lavender Cottage, gaze narrowed on the horizon. If Isabel had discovered the truth behind Montreux, then someone else had likely known she was close. And now the web stretched not only through family, but through time, memory, and betrayal. And it was time to follow that thread. Chapter 10. The diary and the drawer. The air in St. Mildred seemed to have turned heavier, weighted by suspicion, and whispers barely concealed by politeness. In the high street, customers browsed the grocer's shelves and selected apples with uncharacteristic silence. Children, normally riotous after school, walked home in pairs, glancing toward Jedge Cottage if they passed near. It had been 5 days since Isabel Jedge disappeared. The official story delivered with confident finality by Inspector Cray was that Miss Jedge had left of her own accord. A travel trunk was missing from the attic, and a coat no longer hung from its familiar peg. A hastily scribbled note, "I must go away for a while, I will write when I can," had been discovered folded under a teacup in the kitchen. But the note, Miss Marple had thought upon hearing this, was far too convenient. Miss Marple had not voiced her doubts to the inspector. That would have been premature. But neither had she stopped thinking, watching, and above all remembering. Human behavior, she always said, followed patterns. And no pattern Miss Marple could recall ever included Miss Jedge abandoning her life without at least informing the vicar's wife, her closest confidant and bridge partner. Thus it was, on a gray morning with mist crawling across the hedgerows, that Miss Marple returned once more to Jedge Cottage, this time with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Aldershaw, in tow. If she did write such a note, Mrs. Aldershaw said, as they passed through the garden gate, it was not written in a sound state of mind. Isabel was private, but she wasn't reckless. She never traveled further than Cheltenham. Miss Marple agreed with a polite nod, though her thoughts were already inside the cottage. With the police having declared no foul play, the property had been released. Mrs. Aldershaw, as informal next of kin, had been granted temporary access to tend to Isabel's affairs. Miss Marple had, quite innocently, offered to help with the dreadful tedium of dusting. The house smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax, as it always had. But beneath that, Miss Marple detected something else, an emptiness that felt forced, unnatural. "Perhaps we should start in the parlor," she suggested. Mrs. Aldershaw began sorting through unopened letters while Miss Marple moved to the writing desk. It was a dainty walnut piece, worn smooth at the edges. She examined the drawer handles, the lock, the veneer. The main drawers held nothing suspicious, a few ledgers of fabric orders, notes on wedding dress fittings, even scraps of ribbon. But the bottom drawer, the one with the stiffest resistance, gave Miss Marple pause. "Would you look at that?" she said gently, tugging it open. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, soft from wear. Miss Marple looked to Mrs. Aldershaw, who peered over with mild alarm. "I never knew Isabel kept a diary." Miss Marple opened it slowly. The entries began neatly, dated, and brief, each one describing small elements of her day's clients, materials, delays with hemstitching. But somewhere in March, the tone shifted. The entries grew more emotional, occasionally cryptic. March 12th. Must avoid further tea with be too familiar, and I fear he believes there is more between us than ever existed. Must take care. March 28th. The old business returns again. Why must the past insist on clawing its way back just as life settles? The child is grown and no one should know now. April 10th. The package arrived, but not from the person I expected. There's something off, no return address, and the handwriting felt disguised. I've locked it away. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on that entry. Package, locked away. Mrs. Aldershaw, would you know where Miss Jedge kept important personal effects? Something private, perhaps a box or a small case? Mrs. Aldershaw frowned. Well, there is a drawer in the sewing cabinet she always kept locked. Said it. Contained old family keepsakes. They crossed to the parlor where the sewing cabinet stood like a quiet monument to Miss Jedge's profession. Miss Marple knelt before it. The top drawer was locked, just as Mrs. Aldershaw described. But the small key in the top of the writing desk, the one often overlooked, fit perfectly. Inside lay several items, 2 faded photographs, a silver locket, an old telegram dated 1910, and most curious of all, a crumpled envelope, its contents removed. The postmark was smudged, but the handwriting on the outside matched none of the documents found earlier. The scent on the envelope, subtle but distinct, was men's cologne. Miss Marple tucked the envelope carefully into her handbag. Isabel had secrets, she said, standing slowly. Secrets she was protecting from someone or something. Mrs. Aldershaw, still dazed, sat heavily on the sofa. But who would threaten Isabel? Everyone adored her. Miss Marple gave a small, unreadable smile. Adoration and control often wear similar masks, dear, particularly when applied by men of certain temperaments. She said no more. It would do no good to speculate aloud, not yet. There were still puzzle pieces missing, but in her mind a pattern was taking shape. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk through the churchyard. The stone path crunched beneath her sensible. Shoes and the rows of ancient yews whispered in the breeze. She often walked here to think, and today she needed clarity. She passed the old graves, the names and years worn down to ghosts, and paused at the side wall where the Jedge family plot sat in dignified silence. Isabel's parents had both died decades earlier. No siblings, no spouse. And, if the diary hinted correctly, no official child either. But the tone of those entries was unmistakably maternal. Protective, shame-tinged, the child is grown, Isabel had written. A child born in secrecy or adopted away. Miss Marple pressed her lips together, gazing at the headstones. Secrets, she'd learned, had roots deeper than any tree and just as dangerous when unearthed too abruptly. She made her way toward the vicarage just as the bell struck 4. A figure was leaving the side entrance stall, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in an understated way. Mr. Benedict Sharp. He paused, caught sight of Miss Marple, and smiled with calculated warmth. Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Lovely day for reflection. Miss Marple tilted her head. Indeed, quite the season for resurfacing memories. He chuckled, but there was something tight in the way his eyes flicked past her, as if expecting someone else. She gave him a gentle nod and continued on, her gait steady. Miss Marple had begun her day with questions. Now she had a name to pair with them. Chapter 11. The threads that fray. Miss Marple sat at her parlor window with a needle in hand and thoughts far away. The embroidery hoop in her lap was barely touched. She had been attempting a sprig of violets on a handkerchief, but found her concentration fraying like the edges of cheap muslin. Her mind kept circling Benedict Sharp. There had been something too polished in his pleasantry outside the vicarage, too rehearsed, and too convenient. He had arrived in St. Mildred's not 2 weeks before Isabel Jedge's disappearance, ostensibly as a writer seeking countryside quiet for a historical manuscript. But his questions in the tea shop, his interest in old church records, and now his Sudden appearance at the vicarage of all places had shifted him squarely into the realm of suspicion. Not that suspicion alone was ever enough. One had to build cases like one-sewed corset seams secure, unseen, and absolutely unforgiving. To flaws. That afternoon, Miss Marple made a short call to the vicar under the pretense of delivering a jar of her famous green-gage jam. The vicar, a kindly man more fond of classical Latin than parish gossip, greeted her with warmth and invited her in. "I saw Mr. Sharp leaving earlier," she said lightly, setting the jar on the sideboard. "He looked rather pleased with himself." The vicar gave a short laugh. "Yes, yes. He came by to consult the parish records. Curious man, asked quite a lot about the 1910s. I assumed it was for his book." "Did he say what sort of history he's writing?" "Family lineage. Said he was tracing a lost branch from a soldier stationed here during the Great War. Funny business. Most of our records from that period are mundane. Births, deaths, a few illegitimacies." "Illegitimacies?" Miss Marple echoed. "Oh, yes," the vicar said with an absent wave of his hand. "There was one in 1910 that raised some eyebrows in its day. A young woman gave birth at the workhouse infirmary refused to name the father. The child was fostered out by 1911 and eventually taken in by a family in Dorset." Miss Marple's heart gave a subtle lurch. She pressed on, gently. "Would there be any names connected to that record?" The vicar blinked behind his spectacles. "Well, I suppose I shouldn't share details technically private, even so. Many years on. But you know how quiet this village is, Miss Marple? That sort of story lives longer than any tombstone. If I recall rightly, the mother was a girl from a modest household near the Commons. Her name was Margaret Jedge, possibly an aunt of our Isabel." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Possibly." She left the vicarage with far more than jam exchanged. That evening, Miss Marple took out the leather diary again. The April 10th entry replayed in her mind like a whisper behind closed doors. The package arrived, but not from the person I expected. Could it have come from this lost child? Or someone posing as such? And if so, what had been inside? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. To her surprise, it was young Constable Sims, his face red with the effort of formality. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, "might I trouble you for a few minutes of your time? Inspector Craze asked me to gather any lingering impressions from villagers about Miss Jedge. It's a routine follow-up." Miss Marple, hiding her amusement at the phrase routine, invited him in and poured a sensible cup of tea. She was not a woman who made enemies, Miss Marple said. But she was a woman with reasons to remain private. Sims looked up from his notes. Meaning? She was not a gossip, not prone to idle talk. But in my experience, when one avoids small talk altogether, it's not always modesty. It can be a sign of carefully buried truths. Sims nodded, clearly unsure how to translate that into his notebook. Miss Marple continued, "I wonder. Constable, have you heard of Mr. Benedict Sharp?" "Oh, the gentleman renting the room over the bookshop?" Inspector Cray did mention him. But his papers seem in order, passport, references, the lot. "Papers can be arranged," she said gently. Sims leaned forward, intrigued. "You think he might be involved?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I think he might be looking for something or someone. Perhaps even something that was taken from him." The young man was quiet for a moment, then stood. "Well, thank you, Miss Marple. I'll let the inspector know you're keeping your eyes open." She gave a prim smile. "Do tell him that I always do." 2 days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at Miss Marple's door. It was Benedict Sharp. His smile was confident, but something in his posture betrayed unease. He wore a light coat despite the warm weather, and his hands, though clasped, twitched slightly, as if itching to act. "Miss Marple," he said, "may I impose upon you for a few minutes? I've heard you're something of an expert on the village's history." "I do what I can," she said, ushering him in with polite reserve. He glanced at her tidy sitting room with vague interest before taking the seat she offered. "I'm working on a rather sensitive chapter," he began. "One involving the 1910 scandal, the birth of an illegitimate child here in St. Mildred's." Ah, yes, Margaret Jedge. He stiffened, but covered it with a cough. You're very well informed, he said. I listen. He looked at her for a moment, then smiled. You strike me as someone who's already guessed most of what I might say. Perhaps, but I would rather hear you say it. He exhaled. I believe I am the child Margaret gave up. I came across partial adoption records in Dorset. For years I suspected, but only recently confirmed the Jedge connection. When I learned Miss Isabel Jedge was the closest living relative, I reached out, by post? He hesitated. Yes, I didn't want to frighten her. I said I wanted to meet discreetly. But she never replied. She may have been frightened all the same. Sharp looked genuinely pained. I didn't mean any harm. I just wanted something. A sense of belonging, perhaps. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. And did you receive a reply of any kind? He shook his head. No, only silence. Miss Marple studied him, her fingers folded in her lap. You see, Mr. Sharp, I believe Miss Jedge did reply, but not to you. I believe she contacted someone else instead. Someone who frightened her far more than you ever could. Sharp frowned. Who? That, said Miss Marple, rising to her feet, is what I intend to find out. As he left, she noticed something curious. A small triangle of paper poked from beneath the cushion where he'd sat. She picked it up. It was a torn photograph, just the edge of a hand, and what looked like the corner of a child's toy. Faded, but familiar. Miss Marple turned it over. Written in careful pencil, for M.G., with hope for forgiveness. She stood silently by the window for some time, watching Sharp's retreating form vanish into the evening fog. The threads were beginning to fray. But Miss Marple knew once threads fray, they eventually unravel. Chapter 12. The Visitor From. Dorset rain came to St. Mildred's in soft, persistent sheets, painting the cobblestones silver and misting the hedgerows with melancholy. By mid-morning, the sky had settled into a dull pewter gloom, and the village wore its dampness like a shroud. Miss Marple did not mind the weather. It kept curious villagers indoors and lent a certain privacy to her errands. She had risen early, her mind turning over the torn photograph left behind by Mr. Sharp, a small corner of childhood, captured forever in faded tones and addressed to M.G. M.G. That alone confirmed that Isabel had likely known more than she ever admitted. Whether the note was meant to soothe or warn, Miss Marple wasn't sure yet. But she was convinced it was a piece of a larger mosaic. She stepped out under her umbrella, the hooked handle tucked neatly over her arm. Her destination, the cottage of Ada Conroy, the retired midwife who had once served the parish quietly and, according to whispered legend, with an astonishing memory. Ada Conroy was a woman of unflinching directness, wiry in frame and sharp-eyed, despite the cataract in one eye. Her cottage smelled faintly of camphor and onions, and the fireplace crackled even in July. She poured tea with practiced speed and settled into her worn armchair with a grunt. You always did ask the difficult questions, Jane, she said with something between irritation and admiration. I always ask what no one else dares to, Miss Marple replied pleasantly, stirring her tea. Ada narrowed her good eye. You're here about the Jedge girl. I am. There was a pause. The sound of rain ticking on the glass filled the silence. People talk, Ada said eventually, not always truthfully. Margaret Jedge came to me in 1910 terrified and alone. Wouldn't name the father. Said it would ruin everything. And she gave the baby away. Ada nodded. Taken by an orphanage near Dorchester? I heard he was fostered out by age 3. Do you recall anything about the child? Or the mother after the fact? Ada leaned back. Margaret moved. To London not long after. Vanished from village memory. But years later, 1934, I think it was, she came back. Quiet visit, spent one afternoon with her niece, Isabel. Miss Marple blinked. They kept in contact? Oh, not regularly. But Margaret left something with Isabel that day. A small box, sealed. Told her not to open it unless she was. Ever in danger, Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. Do you know what was inside? I never saw it, but I remember Isabel was changed after that, kept more to herself. sold off her old sewing equipment, took fewer clients, and she started attending church again. That final detail struck Miss Marple deeply. The search for absolution was often the surest sign of hidden guilt or knowledge of someone else's. "Thank you, Ada," Miss Marple said sincerely. "You've helped more than you know." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat beside her fire, the photograph in her lap. She had begun to suspect that the box Margaret left behind was the very same package mentioned in Isabel's diary. If so, it was a long-held secret now dangerously exposed. And there was another, quieter development she could no longer ignore. That morning, a letter had arrived from Dorset. She had written to the orphanage under the guise of a historical society inquiry. The reply, penned in a careful librarian's hand, confirmed that a boy born in 1910 and surrendered by one M. Jedge had been registered under the name Samuel Benedict. He was adopted in 1914 by a childless couple from Weymouth. And yes, the clerk wrote, his original birth papers had been requested 2 months ago by a man named Benedict Sharp, so it was not a lie, but a half-truth. He was the child. But why withhold the nature of his communications with Isabel? And then there was the matter of the break-in. Earlier in the week, Miss Marple had learned from Constable Sims that Isabel's cottage had shown signs of forced entry on the night after her disappearance. Nothing of value had been reported, missing only a small wooden box, described by the landlady as a keepsake that Miss Jedge never touched. The door had been left ajar. No fingerprints. No witnesses. Someone had come looking for what was inside. The diary entries between April 10th and May 2nd hinted at increasing paranoia. The lock on the box doesn't feel safe anymore. They're watching the garden gate again. I mustn't leave until I know what to do with it. Miss Marple flipped to the final entry, dated May 3rd. I think I've finally made my decision. It's not safe here. I'll take it where no one will think to look. If anything happens, someone will know where to begin. Such sentences chilled more than any shadowy figure ever could. That evening, Miss Marple called upon Inspector Cray. He was in his office above the local post station. Coat off, sleeves rolled, the look of a man drowning in reports and no closer to the truth. He greeted her with more respect than in earlier meetings. "You're here about Sharp," he guessed. "In part," Miss Marple replied, "but more about motive. I believe Isabel Jedge received something, a legacy not of money, but of truth. And that truth frightened her." Cray leaned forward. "Do you know what it was?" "Not yet, but I suspect someone else did. Someone besides Mr. Sharp." The inspector sat back, drumming his fingers. "We can't place Sharp at the scene on the night she disappeared. But he has no alibi either. Just says he was walking alone, classic fallback." "And the diary? Has it been reviewed properly?" Cray nodded. "My men have combed it. Pages torn, though. At least 3. We're trying to reconstruct the sequence." Miss Marple hesitated. "Did any of the surviving pages mention a name other than Sharp?" Cray nodded. "She wrote initials several times, D.T." Miss Marple felt a flutter of recognition. D.T. Daphne Travers. The girl who had cried in the sewing room. The same who, now married and living in a grand house just outside the village, had told Miss Marple she knew nothing helpful, but perhaps she had known far too much. That night Miss Marple could not sleep. The wind rustled the hedges, and the rain returned gentler now, more sorrowful than threatening. She sat in her nightrobe beside the fire, the diary open on her lap, the torn photo by the lamp. 3 initials. 3 lives intertwined. Margaret Jedge, Isabel, and the child who had returned. But it was not the returning child who frightened Isabel most. It was someone already here, someone who had known all along. And if the diary's missing pages had named them, they would have had every reason to make sure Isabel vanished and that the box, the legacy, the confession disappeared with her. Miss Marple stared into the dying fire. The thimble was still missing. But soon, she thought, someone would prick their finger on the truth. Chapter 13. The seamstress's last stitch the morning after the rain. St. Mildred's awoke swathed in a delicate mist that made the village lanes appear dreamlike and distant. Miss Marple stirred early, as she always did when her mind refused the comfort of sleep. Her fingers hovered over the diary pages once more, searching for nuance, for any shadow of meaning she might have missed. D.T. Daphne Travers. The name now rang louder in her mind than any other. Isabel had noted the initials multiple times toward the end of the diary, always in a tone tinged with dread or remorse. D.T. knows, I can't believe she remembered. She said she burned the letter, but I can't trust that. And most damning, if anything happens to me, it will be because D.T. feared the past more than the present. Miss Marple placed her spectacles neatly upon the page and sat back in her chair, knitting, needles idle in her lap. The Travers family had long kept to themselves, preferring the company of gardeners and groundsmen to neighbors and village fetes. Daphne herself had once been a bright, thoughtful girl, prone to silences, married off young to a businessman from Cheltenham with whom she now shared a house far too large for two. Miss Marple had long since learned that silence is rarely emptiness, it is containment. She dressed quickly and tucked Isabel's photograph and diary beneath her coat. This conversation would require delicacy, but there was no avoiding it. The Travers estate stood at the edge of town, a Tudor-style house that looked newer than it should, with a gravel path as white and crisp as bone. Daphne answered the door herself. She wore a navy jumper and tailored skirt, her hair tied in a knot that looked effortlessly precise. Her eyes flicked downward. Miss Marple, she said, surprise expertly hidden beneath a social smile. How unexpected, Miss Marple smiled benignly. I do hope I'm not intruding. I was in the area and thought I'd call. The weather's improved at last, hasn't it? Daphne hesitated, then stepped aside. Do come in. My husband's away at the solicitor's. Tea? Only if it's no trouble. Within moments, Miss Marple was seated in the parlor, a space immaculately arranged, its minimalism betraying a subtle anxiety for control. The tea arrived in delicate china, a polished silver spoon resting against the saucer. Daphne poured without speaking. I imagine you've heard about Isabel Jedge, Miss Marple began quietly. Daphne's hand paused for a fraction. Yes. Dreadful, poor woman, always so private. Some would say secretive. Daphne's lips twitched. You could say the same of you, Miss Marple. True, but I don't mind being questioned. There was a short silence. Rain pattered faintly on the conservatory windows. I've come across something, Miss Marple continued, in Isabel's diary. Your initials. Daphne looked up sharply. Yes, D's several times, she seemed. Distressed about something you might have known or done. Daphne's jaw tightened. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might walk away, but instead she sat straighter, eyes fixed on the mantel. We were girls then, Daphne said at last. Isabel was 16. I was 15. It was the spring of 1927, Miss Marple listened without interrupting. She showed me something once, something she wasn't meant to have. A letter from her Aunt Margaret. It was hidden in a hollow book. The letter talked about a child, a boy, given away. There was a name in it, too, but I've forgotten it now. Daphne looked down into her teacup. I remember asking why she kept it. Isabel said she didn't know why, only that her aunt had made her promise never to destroy it. She thought it might be important one day. Did you burn it? Miss Marple asked softly. Daphne's throat worked before she spoke. Yes, years later. We had both moved on, married, moved away. But I visited her in 1942 during the war, and she was frightened. She said someone had written to her asking about the child. She showed me the letter again. I told her to destroy it. I didn't want to be involved. She refused. Her voice wavered, and for a moment Miss Marple saw the frightened 15-year-old still inside her. Then one night I went back. She had left the kitchen window unlatched. I took the letter and burned it in the hearth. You were afraid? I had just had a child of my own. The world was crumbling around us. I couldn't risk some scandal about the past reaching my husband's name or our future. Isabel never forgave me. Miss Marple sat quietly, the pieces beginning to realign. Did you ever tell anyone else? No, but someone else found out. I'm sure of it now. Someone who came after the letter. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Perhaps that's what the box was for. Daphne blinked. Box? A keepsake. Left by Margaret, Isabel kept it sealed for years. But shortly before she vanished, she mentioned taking it somewhere safe. It's missing now. Daphne stood and began pacing, her shoes whispering across the wood. I don't know anything about that. I thought this was buried, that no one else remembered. Someone always remembers, Miss Marple said gently. As she left the Travers estate, Miss Marple paused near the low wall that bordered the property. Beyond the hedge, the church spire was just visible through the thinning fog. She felt the weight of the diary in her bag, the photograph beside it. There were now 3 suspects who had been touched by the truth of Margaret Jedge's child. Isabel, who had hidden it, Mr. Sharp, who had come searching, and Daphne Travers, who had tried to erase it. But none of them had motive for violence unless, of course, the truth threatened something greater: inheritance, identity, reputation, or bloodlines. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple examined the torn photograph again. The child had dimples, a slant to the eyes, a peculiar tilt of the head. She had seen it before somewhere, quite recently. It wasn't in Mr. Sharp. It was in someone else. Someone close. The doorbell rang. She tucked the photograph away and rose slowly. At the door stood a young woman, nervous, rain-soaked, her coat clinging to her frame. She carried a satchel. Miss Marple? She asked in a whisper. Yes, dear. My name is well. I think I might be in danger. You're the only one who might understand. Miss Marple stepped aside to let her in. Of course, child. Let's sit by the fire. There's always room for one more truth. As the girl stepped into the light, Miss Marple noticed something else. The same tilt of the head. Chapter 14. The inheritance clause. Miss Marple led the young woman into the sitting room with quiet efficiency, her mind already a flurry of deductions and connections. The girl's resemblance to the child in the photograph could not be a coincidence. Same fine-boned features, same soft, unruly hair, and that subtle, unmistakable tilt of the head. But she said nothing of this yet. Now was the time to listen. Sit, dear. You must be chilled through, Miss Marple said gently, guiding her to the chair nearest the fire. Would you like tea? Or perhaps cocoa? Tea, please, the girl said, her voice thin but polite. Miss Marple bustled into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a tray. As she poured, she glanced at the girl more closely. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with a modest satchel resting on her lap, clutched tightly as though it were the only thing anchoring her. Now then, Miss Marple said as she handed her the tea, what is your name, and why do you believe? You're in danger? The girl took a long sip before answering. My name is Lillian, or at least that's what I was told. Lillian Gray. But that might not be my real name. I don't know anymore. That's why I came. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. Do go on. I was raised in Dorset by a woman named Ruth Gray. She wasn't cruel, just distant. She told me my parents died in a fire when I was a baby. I believed that for most of my life. But 2 weeks ago she collapsed. Stroke. She's been drifting in and out. Yesterday she called for me and said something strange. She said, tell the woman in the photo, tell her Margaret's box is still locked. And then she started crying. I didn't know who Margaret was, but she repeated again and again. Margaret Jedge, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. Lillian nodded, setting the cup down. I went through her desk. I shouldn't have, I know, but I was desperate. I found a letter tucked in the lining of a drawer. It was addressed to Isabel. It mentioned a child me, I think. And it warned her that someone else might come looking for the truth, someone who didn't want it known. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes alight. Did it say who? No, but it said something about bloodlines and inheritance. That's when I got frightened. Ruth always made me feel like I was temporary, like she was just waiting to be rid of me. But if this is true, if someone else thinks I stand in the way of something— You were wise to come, Miss Marple said gently. She reached for the satchel and with Lillian's permission opened it. Inside was the letter, yellowed and creased. The handwriting was unmistakable, flowing and confident, the same as in the diary entries. Margaret Jedge's hand. She read quickly, "My dearest Isabel, the child is safe. Ruth will raise her quietly under the name Gray. I cannot say more in writing, but you must guard this knowledge. There are those who would not welcome the child's existence becoming known. If anything should happen to me or to you, ensure the girl finds her way to the woman in the photograph, the one you keep hidden. She will know what to do. Do not trust anyone who speaks of inheritance or titles. They are not your concern." "They never were." Miss Marple folded the letter with care. "Did Ruth ever speak of a box? Or a photograph?" Lillian shook her head. "No, but I found this in her drawer too." She handed Miss Marple a cracked envelope. Inside was a black and white photo of a woman in her 30s, Isabel, unmistakably, and beside her, a child. In a prom, the baby's face was obscured, but Isabel's expression was soft and proud. There was something else in the envelope, too. A key. Small and tarnished, shaped unusually perhaps for a locket or a keepsake box. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "This may be the key to the missing box," she said. "Isabel mentioned hiding it shortly before she disappeared. If we can find that box, we may yet understand everything." Lillian looked uncertain. "But what if someone's still after it?" "Oh, someone surely is," Miss Marple said, lightly, "but that's no reason to stop." She rose, moving to her bookshelf where a map of St. Mildred's parish had been pinned discreetly behind a faux book spine. She unfolded it and gestured for Lillian to join her. "Tell me," she said, "did Isabel or Ruth ever speak of a safe place?" Lillian hesitated. "Only once. Ruth used to mutter about the house that always watches. I thought she meant her own. She was always suspicious. But it didn't feel right." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That phrase, "always watches," could refer to the old rectory tower, or— She tapped the map. "I wonder if it's referring to the Dovecote." "The what?" "A small stone structure at the edge of town. It's derelict now, but in years past it served as a kind of lookout. It's known locally as the Watching Eye. If Isabel wanted to hide something out of reach, that would be the place." Lillian's breath caught. "Should we go now?" Miss Marple gave her a small, firm smile. "No, not tonight. Someone else may be watching. We'll go early, before the village stirs. Until then, you'll stay here." That night, the cottage was silent except for the occasional pop from the hearth. Miss Marple watched Lillian sleep on the divan, peaceful but haunted, as if her dreams flickered at the edges of something long buried. Miss Marple knitted in silence, her fingers steady but her thoughts racing. She now knew the truth. Margaret had died protecting a child. Not born out of scandal, but concealed for inheritance purposes. Someone powerful, someone with much to lose, had arranged to keep the child Lillian hidden. But secrets rot in the dark, and someone was determined to prevent it from surfacing. Isabel's disappearance, the torn photograph, the missing box, and the visit from Mr. Sharp, it all tied back to a legacy someone else wanted erased. But who, and who, if not Mr. Sharp, had followed Isabel that day? Who had watched her house, waited until the evening, and ensured her silence? Miss Marple looked again at the photograph from Lillian's envelope. Isabel's proud smile. A baby's prom. And in the distance, this almost unnoticeable glint of metal. A weather vane perched atop the dovecote. It had to be there. She rose quietly and checked the locks, then placed the envelope and key beneath her pillow. Tomorrow they would search, and they would find that box, and with it perhaps the final thread to unravel the whole mystery. Chapter 15. The Dovecote Revelation. The mist clung low over St. Mildred's as dawn crept across the village rooftops. A brittle frost glazed the hedgerows, and the fields wore a veil of white, muffling every sound beneath a hush that felt sacred. The village slumbered, unaware that two figures were making their way along a narrow footpath at the edge of Bell Hill. Miss Marple walked steadily, her sensible boots crunching quietly on the hardened earth. Beside her, Lillian trod with more uncertainty, glancing around as if she expected someone to emerge from the mist at any moment. "There's no need to be nervous, my dear miss," Marple said without looking at her. The best time to explore secrets is when no one expects you to be looking. The path curved gently around a copse of ash trees and opened into a clearing where the old dovecote stood like a forgotten sentry. Built of stone, with ivy trailing from its crumbling edges, it looked more like a miniature tower than a birdhouse. The conical roof had lost several slates, and the wooden door hung half off its hinges. Yet it remained, stubborn and still, like it had been waiting all these years for their arrival. "This is it," Miss Marple murmured. Lillian hesitated. "Are you sure no one followed us?" "I am," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But stay by me just the same." She pushed the door gently. It gave a low groan and opened inward, revealing a cool, dim interior. The floor was packed earth, uneven and mottled with decades of bird droppings and moss. High above, empty. Niches once meant for doves stared down like hollow eyes. Miss Marple stepped inside, her gaze sweeping across the circular walls. Margaret once mentioned in a letter that this place was used by the Jedge family to store private documents during the war parish records, mostly. She said it was considered safer than the vicarage vault, oddly enough. She moved to the center, withdrew the small brass key from her pocket, and looked for a sign anything. "There," Lillian whispered, pointing. A square panel low on the wall looked newer than the stone around it wooden, with a small brass escutcheon. Miss Marple knelt and fit the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click. With care, she opened the hidden panel. Inside was a narrow box, no longer than a loaf of bread, bound in black leather. She drew it out reverently and placed it on a stone ledge near the light. The box was locked with a second clasp, no keyhole this time, only a small circular depression. Miss Marple ran her fingers over it. "It requires pressure, not a key," she said. She pressed the depression with a firm thumb, and with a soft pop the lid lifted. Inside lay a neat arrangement of letters, some wrapped in ribbon, others sealed with wax. Beneath them was a second compartment. She gently lifted the false bottom and found what she had half suspected, a birth certificate, faded but intact. She unfolded it slowly, letting the morning light reveal its contents. Name of child: Lillian Margaret Everdeen mother, Isabel Jedge father, Edward Everdeen. 6th Viscount Winterle date of birth, April 18th, 1933. Lillian sucked in a breath. "That's," Miss Marple nodded solemnly. "Your father was a peer of the realm? This explains everything?" Lillian looked stunned. "But he never claimed me. He never came for me." "I suspect," Miss Marple said gently, "that he never knew. Or if he did, he chose duty over decency. Isabel and Margaret must have conspired to keep you safe, knowing what kind of turmoil your existence would bring to his line of inheritance." She lifted a smaller envelope, marked only with initials. E.E. Inside was a single page written in Isabel's hand. "Dearest Edward, I could not destroy this truth, even if you have chosen your path. Lillian is your daughter. I have never asked anything of you, nor will I again. But if anything should happen to me or to Margaret, someone must know she exists. Not for title or money, but for identity. She deserves to know who she is. Isabel." Miss Marple folded the letter with care, then turned to Lillian. "Your mother wanted you to know the truth one day, and Margaret gave her life to protect it." Lillian looked down at the documents, her expression unreadable. "So that's why they were afraid. If I was known, it would threaten the entire line. But why now? Why would someone still care after all these years?" Miss Marple's expression darkened. "Because the 7th Viscount Winterle died last spring. His heir is in dispute, his will contested. If your existence were revealed, it could unseat the current claimant." "Mr. Sharp?" Lillian whispered. "He mentioned Winterle." "Sighed I had no stake." Miss Marple nodded. "Because if you did, it would unravel everything. I believe he's working for someone who very much wants the past buried." Suddenly a creak echoed through the dovecote. They both froze, footsteps slow, deliberate, approached from outside. Miss Marple quickly closed the box and slipped it back into the hidden compartment. She locked it and stood. The door swung open. It was Reverend Ames. His tall figure filled the doorway, casting a long shadow across the stone floor. He held his hat in one hand and wore an unreadable expression. "I thought I saw movement from the road," he said slowly. "I come here sometimes to think." Miss Marple gave him a benign smile. "We were walking. Miss Lillian has an interest in old architecture. Miss Lillian, is it?" he said softly, his eyes not leaving the girl. "You look familiar." "Many girls do at her age," Miss Marple said smoothly, "though I imagine you're not accustomed to seeing them poking around abandoned dovecotes before breakfast." There was a pause, a long one. "Indeed," he said finally. "Well, I'll leave you to your walk." He turned and left as quietly as he had come. When he was gone, Lillian said, "You don't trust him?" Miss Marple gave a tight smile. "I trust very few people when inheritance and titles are involved." She straightened and took one final look around. "Come, we've what we came for. Now we must decide what to do with it." As they walked back toward the village, the mist began to lift. A pale gold sunlight pierced through the trees, and the wind stirred gently. But Miss Marple felt no comfort in the breeze. The truth was out, and someone, somewhere, would do anything to keep it from spreading.